In the sweltering summer of 1716, 14 of South Carolina's wealthiest plantation owners gathered for what they believed would be a routine business meeting at the Grayfield estate. None of them walked out alive. What authorities discovered 3 days later defied explanation. Charred remains arranged in a perfect circle around a massive coal furnace, their hands bound with iron shackles, their mouths stuffed with raw cotton. The only witness was a slave woman named Esperanza de Lima, found sitting calmly in the estate's kitchen, humming a Portuguese lullaby while methodically sharpening kitchen knives. When questioned, she spoke only one phrase in broken English: "Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete." Colonial records of this incident were sealed by order of Governor Robert Johnson and remained buried in Charleston's archives for over 2 centuries. Tonight, we reveal the terrifying truth behind what became known as the Grayfield Massacre, a story of vengeance so methodical and brutal that it changed how the entire colony viewed their human property. Before we continue with the story of Esperanza de Lima and the night that shook colonial South Carolina to its core, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one, buried by time and covered up by those in power, deserve to be told. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Are there any dark historical secrets hiding in your own backyard? Now, let's step back to 1716 and discover how a woman who was considered nothing more than property orchestrated one of the most calculated acts of revenge in colonial American history. The story begins not with that horrific night, but 15 years earlier in the bustling port city of Charleston, South Carolina. The year was 1701. And the colony was experiencing unprecedented prosperity built on the backs of enslaved Africans who worked the rice plantations that stretched along the coastal lowlands. Among the most successful planters was Edmund Grayfield, a second-generation colonist whose family had carved out a 3,000-acre empire from the swamplands north of the Ashley River. Grayfield was a man of particular cruelty, even by the harsh standards of his time. Standing over 6 feet tall with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, he had earned a reputation for breaking slaves both physically and mentally. His plantation, known as Grayfield Estate, was whispered about in the slave quarters throughout the region. It was said that slaves sent there either died within a year or emerged as hollow shells of their former selves. In September of 1701, a Portuguese slave ship called the Santa Maria arrived in Charleston Harbor carrying 180 souls from the coast of Angola. Among them was a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, who would be given the name Esperanza de Lima by her new owner. What made her different from the other slaves was not immediately apparent to the white colonists who inspected her like livestock at the market. She was of average height and build, with intelligent dark eyes and intricate tribal scarification on her shoulders that told the story of her royal lineage, a story that would remain unknown to her captors. What they didn't know was that Esperanza had been the daughter of a powerful village chief, trained from childhood in the arts of strategy, negotiation, and what colonial minds would have dismissed as witchcraft, but was actually a sophisticated understanding of herbs, poisons, and human psychology. She had witnessed the Portuguese raiders burn her village, murder her father, and enslave her people. In her mind, every white face she encountered was connected to that original sin. Edmund Grayfield purchased her for £42 sterling, a considerable sum that reflected her apparent health and young age. He had specific plans for his new acquisition. Grayfield's previous house slave, an older woman named Sarah, had recently died under mysterious circumstances, though everyone on the plantation knew she had been beaten to death for spilling wine on his imported English carpet. From her first day at Grayfield Estate, Esperanza began what would become a 15-year campaign of careful observation and meticulous planning. She learned English quickly, but pretended to understand far less than she actually did. She watched, she listened, she remembered every slight, every cruelty, every name mentioned in hushed conversations among the plantation elite. The Grayfield Estate was more than just a home. It was the unofficial meeting place for what the planters called the Rice Council, a group of 14 plantation owners who controlled the colony's agricultural policies and, by extension, its political future. These men met monthly to discuss rice prices, slave regulations, and how to maximize their profits while minimizing colonial oversight from London. They saw themselves as kings of their own domains, answerable to no earthly authority. The 14 members of this council represented the most powerful families in the colony. Edmund Greyfield, the unofficial leader. William Pemberton, whose plantation produced more rice than any other in the Americas. James Rutherford, who also served as a colonial judge. Marcus Sutton, who owned the largest slave trading operation between Charleston and Savannah. Henry Caldwell, whose political connections reached all the way to the governor's office. Thomas Harrington, a former British naval officer who ruled his plantation like a military compound. Benjamin Fairfax, whose family fortune dated back to the earliest colonial settlements. Samuel Kingsley, who specialized in seasoning newly arrived African slaves. Robert Fielding, known for his innovative torture techniques. Charles Warwick, whose plantation bordered 3 others and served as a nexus for information. Jonathan Crichton, who maintained detailed records of slave breeding programs. David Norris, whose medical background made him particularly effective at keeping slaves alive just long enough to extract maximum labor. Alexander Hartwell, whose plantation served as a prison for runaway slaves from across the region. And finally, George Baxter, the youngest member at 35, whose enthusiasm for violence had earned him rapid acceptance into this exclusive circle. These were not simply cruel men. They were systematically evil, treating human beings as nothing more than agricultural equipment to be used, repaired, and discarded as economics dictated. They shared techniques for breaking rebellious spirits, compared notes on optimal caloric intake to maximize work output while minimizing costs, and boasted about their most creative punishments during their monthly gatherings. Esperanza served at these meetings for 15 years, moving silently around the dining room like a shadow, refilling glasses and clearing plates while these men discussed their human property like cattle. She heard them laugh about families they had separated, debate the merits of whipping versus branding, and plan expansions of their operations that would require the importation of hundreds more slaves. But what truly set Esperanza's plan in motion was not just the general cruelty of slavery. It was something far more specific and personal. In the spring of 1715, everything changed for Esperanza de Lima. After 14 years of silent servitude, she had done something that plantation owners considered impossible. She had maintained her humanity while living in hell. More than that, she had found love. His name was Kwame, though the plantation records listed him simply as Boy Tom. He had been born on the Rutherford plantation in 1693, making him 22 years old when he caught Esperanza's attention. Kwame possessed a rare combination of physical strength and intellectual curiosity that had somehow survived the brutal seasoning process that broke most slaves within their first year. He could read, a skill he had learned in secret from a sympathetic overseer who had since died, and he had been secretly teaching other slaves basic letters and numbers during the brief rest periods on Sundays. Kwame and Esperanza began meeting in secret, initially sharing information about the movements and plans of their owners. Their relationship deepened slowly, carefully, with the patience of people who understood that discovery would mean death. They communicated through a system of songs and gestures that appeared to be nothing more than typical slave behavior to white observers, but carried detailed messages about escape routes, friendly contacts, and opportunities for resistance. By late 1715, they had developed what was perhaps the most sophisticated intelligence network in colonial South Carolina. Esperanza used her position at the Rice Council meetings to gather information about patrol schedules, legal changes, and plantation vulnerabilities. While Kwame used his work assignments, he was frequently loaned out to other plantations for heavy labor to establish contacts throughout the region. They were planning something unprecedented. Not a simple escape attempt that would affect only themselves, but a coordinated uprising that could potentially free hundreds of slaves across multiple plantations. They had identified sympathetic whites, mapped out safe houses, and even established contact with free black communities in Spanish Florida who could provide sanctuary for escaped slaves. But their careful planning was undone by simple human emotion. On March 15, 1716, Edmund Greyfield announced at the monthly Rice Council meeting that he had decided to expand his breeding program. He had identified several prime specimens among his female slaves who would be paired with males from other plantations to produce what he called superior working stock. The program would begin immediately, with selected females being moved to a separate compound where they would be monitored constantly to ensure successful pregnancies. Esperanza's name was at the top of his list. When she overheard this conversation while serving wine to the council members, her face remained impassive, but something fundamental shifted inside her. She had survived 15 years of slavery by maintaining hope. Hope for freedom, hope for revenge, hope for a future where she could live as a human being rather than property. Now Greyfield was planning to reduce her to nothing more than a breeding animal. That night, she met Kwame at their usual spot, a fallen cypress tree deep in the plantation's rice fields, where the sound of their voices would be masked by the chorus of insects and nightbirds. She told him about Greyfield's plan, and they both understood what it meant. Once she was moved to the breeding compound, their contact would become impossible. Their intelligence network would collapse. Their planned uprising would die before it began. Kwame's response was immediate and desperate. They should run that very night. He had made contact with a Spanish trader who could smuggle them to St. Augustine within a week. They could be free, start a new life, maybe even find a way to help other slaves from relative safety. But Esperanza refused. "Running saves us," she told him in their native Portuguese, a language they used only for their most private conversations. "But it changes nothing for our people. These men will continue their evil. More ships will arrive, more families will be destroyed, more children will grow up as property." She had spent 15 years watching these 14 men make decisions that affected thousands of lives with casual cruelty. She had heard them laugh about separations, discuss torture techniques like culinary recipes, and plan expansions of their operations that would bring even more suffering to people who looked like her. "I have learned their patterns," she continued. "I know their secrets. I know when they are most vulnerable. We have one chance to send a message that will be remembered forever. One chance to make them afraid the way they make us afraid." Kwame understood what she was suggesting, and he was terrified. Not of death. Slaves lived with the constant threat of death, but of the systematic torture that would precede execution if they were caught. He had seen what happened to slaves who raised their hands against whites. The punishments were designed to serve as examples, to break the spirits of every other slave who witnessed them. But he also understood that Esperanza was right. Their planned escape would save 2 lives while leaving the system intact. Her alternative was unthinkably dangerous, but it offered the possibility of something greater, a blow against slavery itself that might inspire others, or at least make slave owners think twice about their casual cruelty. They spent the next 2 weeks refining a plan that was part intelligence operation, part psychological warfare, and part tactical strike. Esperanza would use her access to the monthly Rice Council meeting to create an opportunity for devastating retaliation. Kwame would handle logistics, acquiring materials, establishing alibis for sympathetic slaves, and creating contingency plans for various scenarios. What they developed was perhaps the most sophisticated act of slave resistance in colonial American history. And it all centered on a simple fact that Esperanza had observed over 15 years of service. The Rice Council members were so confident in their absolute power that they had become careless about their personal security. The monthly meeting scheduled for June 23, 1716, would be their last. June 23, 1716, dawned with the oppressive heat that made South Carolina's summers nearly unbearable for everyone except those who had grown up with the climate of equatorial Africa. Esperanza woke before sunrise, as she had every day for 15 years, and began her morning routine. But today was different. Today was the culmination of 15 years of careful observation, meticulous planning, and suppressed rage. The monthly Rice Council meeting was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, giving the 14 plantation owners time to travel to Greyfield Estate and conduct any preliminary business before the formal session. These meetings typically lasted 4 to 6 hours, depending on the agenda and the amount of imported rum that Edmund Greyfield provided for his guests. Esperanza had spent weeks studying the patterns of previous meetings, noting everything from seating arrangements to bathroom breaks to the timing of various agenda items. She knew that Marcus Sutton always arrived early to conduct private business with Greyfield. She knew that Benjamin Fairfax had a weak bladder and would excuse himself approximately every 90 minutes. She knew that the discussion of rice prices always happened before dinner was served, while conversations about slave management typically occurred afterward when the rum had loosened their tongues. Most importantly, she knew about the coal furnace. Greyfield Estate had been built in 1695 with a massive kitchen designed to feed not only the main house, but also the various overseers, craftsmen, and domestic slaves who lived on the property. The centerpiece of this kitchen was an enormous coal-burning furnace that had been imported from Britain at considerable expense. Unlike the wood-burning fireplaces found in most colonial homes, this furnace could maintain extremely high temperatures for extended periods, making it ideal for large-scale cooking operations. The furnace stood nearly 8 feet tall and 4 feet square, built of imported fire brick and surrounded by iron fixtures for hanging pots, supporting spits, and regulating airflow. When fully stoked with coal, it could reach temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper and silver. Greyfield took enormous pride in this furnace, often showing it to visitors as an example of his prosperity and sophistication. What Greyfield didn't know was that Esperanza had been secretly studying the furnace's operation for months, learning how to control its temperature, how to maintain maximum heat for extended periods, and how to manipulate its airflow to create specific conditions. She had also been gradually stockpiling coal in a storage room adjacent to the kitchen, telling the overseers that Mr. Greyfield had ordered extra fuel for a planned expansion of cooking operations. 3 days before the meeting, Esperanza received devastating news that solidified her resolve beyond any possibility of doubt. Kwame had been sold. James Rutherford had decided that his plantation needed additional field hands for an expansion project, and he had convinced Greyfield to sell him Boy Tom for £60 sterling. The transaction would be completed immediately after the Rice Council meeting, with Kwame being transferred to the Rutherford plantation the following morning. When Esperanza learned of this sale, she understood that her window of opportunity was closing forever. In 3 days, she would lose the man she loved, be forced into a breeding program that would destroy her spirit, and watch helplessly as the Rice Council continued its systematic brutalization of her people. The time for patience had ended. That evening, she met Kwame for what they both knew would be the last time. They spoke in whispers beside the fallen cypress tree, sharing 15 years of memories compressed into a few precious hours. Kwame begged her one final time to abandon her plan and run away with him that very night. There was still time to escape to Spanish Florida, still time to build a life together away from the horror of plantation slavery. But Esperanza's mind was made up. "These men believe they are gods," she told him. "They believe they can do anything to us without consequence. Tomorrow I will show them they are wrong. I will show them that we are human beings, not animals, and that human beings fight back when pushed beyond endurance." Kwame understood that arguing was useless. He had known Esperanza for less than 2 years, but he had learned to recognize the steel in her voice when her mind was completely made up. Instead, he spent their remaining time together, helping her refine the final details of her plan. The next morning, June 22nd, Esperanza began her final preparations. She started by conducting a thorough inventory of the kitchen and adjoining storage areas, identifying every tool, ingredient, and material that might be useful. She paid particular attention to the iron shackles and chains that were stored in the kitchen's pantry, devices typically used for restraining slaves during punishment, but kept readily available throughout the plantation. She also made careful note of the kitchen's layout and the movement patterns of other domestic slaves throughout the day. The success of her plan would depend partly on ensuring that innocent slaves were not present when events unfolded, and partly on maintaining the appearance of normal operations until the critical moment arrived. Most importantly, she began preparing the coal furnace. Starting at dawn, she began feeding coal into the furnace at carefully timed intervals, gradually increasing the internal temperature while maintaining the appearance of routine cooking preparations. By late morning, the furnace was approaching peak operating temperature, ready to maintain maximum heat for several hours. The other domestic slaves noticed nothing unusual about Esperanza's behavior. She had always been quiet and methodical in her work, and her preparations for the monthly Rice Council meeting appeared identical to her routine for previous gatherings. She cleaned the dining room, arranged the furniture, prepared serving dishes, and set up the imported crystal glasses that Grayfield used to impress his guests. But hidden in the kitchen, arrangements were being made that would transform a routine business meeting into something far more sinister. By noon on June 23, 1716, the first of the Rice Council members had begun arriving at Grayfield Estate. As always, Marcus Sutton arrived early, riding up the oak-lined avenue that led to the main house, with the confidence of a man who owned over 800 human beings and considered himself answerable to no earthly authority. Esperanza watched from the kitchen window as Sutton dismounted his horse and handed the reins to a stable slave. At 53 years old, Sutton was one of the older members of the Rice Council, and his body showed the effects of decades of rich living. He was heavily built, with thinning grey hair and the red-faced complexion of a man who drank more imported rum than was strictly healthy. But his eyes remained sharp and calculating, the eyes of someone who had built his fortune by viewing human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited with maximum efficiency. Sutton's plantation specialized in what was euphemistically called seasoning, the brutal process of breaking newly arrived African slaves and teaching them to accept their condition as permanent and inescapable. Slaves who proved particularly resistant to seasoning were often sold to Sutton, who had developed increasingly creative methods for destroying their will to resist. His techniques had become so refined that other plantation owners regularly sent their problem slaves to his operation, paying premium prices for his services. Edmund Grayfield greeted Sutton at the front door with the elaborate courtesy that plantation owners reserved for each other while treating their slaves like livestock. The two men retired to Grayfield's private study to discuss business matters that were too sensitive for the larger group, primarily new techniques for slave control and strategies for lobbying the colonial government to reduce restrictions on slave importation. Over the next hour, the remaining 12 members of the Rice Council arrived in small groups, their carriages and horses creating a traffic jam around the circular drive that fronted the main house. Esperanza recognized each man as he arrived, having served at enough meetings to know their faces, their voices, and their particular areas of expertise in the management of human property. William Pemberton arrived with his usual retinue of armed overseers, a precaution he had adopted after a recent slave rebellion attempt on his plantation had been narrowly suppressed. James Rutherford came alone, but his horse bore the distinctive silver-mounted pistols that advertised his dual role as plantation owner and colonial magistrate. Henry Caldwell traveled in an elaborately decorated carriage that displayed his family's coat of arms, a pretentious affectation that highlighted his political connections and social ambitions. Each arrival was greeted with the same ceremonial courtesy, the same exchange of pleasantries about weather and crops and the persistent Indian problem along the frontier. These men saw themselves as the founding fathers of a great civilization, pioneers who were transforming a wilderness into productive agricultural land that would feed the growing cities of colonial America. What they refused to acknowledge was that their civilization was built on a foundation of systematic brutality, that their wealth came from the unpaid labor of thousands of human beings who were treated worse than livestock, and that their political influence existed primarily to perpetuate and expand this system of exploitation. At 2 o'clock precisely, Edmund Grayfield called the monthly meeting to order in his formal dining room. The 14 men took their customary seats around a massive oak table that had been imported from England at a cost that would have supported a typical colonial family for several years. The table's polished surface reflected the light from dozens of candles arranged in silver candelabras, creating an atmosphere of wealth and sophistication that reinforced their sense of superiority and entitlement. Esperanza began serving the meal with her usual efficiency, moving silently around the table as these men discussed the business of slavery with the casual brutality that had characterized their previous 180 monthly meetings. She had heard variations of these conversations hundreds of times, but today she listened with particular attention to every word, every tone, every casual reference to human suffering. The agenda began, as always, with a discussion of rice prices in the Charleston market and strategies for maximizing profits in the coming harvest season. William Pemberton reported that his plantation had achieved record production levels by implementing what he called incentive-based management, a system that provided minimal food rewards for slaves who exceeded daily quotas while subjecting underperformers to systematic punishment. The key, Pemberton explained while cutting his imported beef, is making them understand that their comfort level depends entirely on their productivity. Give them just enough hope to keep working, but never enough security to make them complacent. James Rutherford nodded approvingly. I've had excellent results with family separation as a motivational tool. Nothing makes a field hand work harder than knowing that his wife and children are being held at a different location, and that reunion depends on consistent performance. The conversation continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with each member sharing techniques for extracting maximum labor from their human property while minimizing expenses for food, housing, and medical care. They discussed breeding programs with the same clinical detachment that cattle ranchers used when planning livestock improvements. They compared notes on punishment techniques with the enthusiasm of craftsmen sharing professional secrets. Esperanza refilled wine glasses and cleared plates while these men celebrated their latest innovations in human degradation. She maintained her usual expression of blank subservience, but inside her mind, she was making final mental notes about each man's position, each man's habits, and each man's potential for resistance when the time came. As the formal agenda concluded and the conversation became more informal, the men began sharing stories that revealed the true depths of their cruelty. Marcus Sutton described a new torture device he had imported from the Caribbean, a metal cage barely large enough for a human body that was suspended in full sunlight and could literally cook rebellious slaves to death over a period of several days. Samuel Kingsley boasted about his latest breeding experiment, which involved forcibly pairing selected slaves to produce what he hoped would be a new generation of larger, stronger field hands. But it was George Baxter, the youngest member of the council, who provided the final catalyst for what was about to unfold. "Gentlemen," Baxter announced as Esperanza poured brandy for the post-dinner drinks, "I have exciting news about a new business opportunity. The Spanish are paying premium prices for experienced slaves in their South American territories. I'm proposing that we pool our resources to purchase a large ship and begin systematic exportation of our older, less productive stock." The room erupted in enthusiastic discussion as the 14 men began calculating the potential profits from selling their human property to Spanish colonies where working conditions were even more brutal than those in South Carolina. They debated logistics, discussed political connections who could facilitate the necessary permits, and estimated how many slaves they could export while maintaining adequate labor forces for their plantations. As Esperanza listened to these men plan the destruction of even more lives, she felt something inside her snap. For 15 years she had maintained her sanity by telling herself that their cruelty had limits, that even these evil men would eventually recognize some boundaries of human decency. But there were no limits. There were no boundaries. Their capacity for causing suffering was constrained only by economic considerations and their own imagination. It was time to show them what it felt like to be powerless. At exactly 9:47 p.m., according to the imported German clock that stood in Grayfield's dining room, Esperanza de Lima made her move. The 14 members of the Rice Council had finished their formal business and settled into the comfortable after-dinner conversation that typically concluded their monthly meetings. The room was warm with body heat and candlelight, filled with the smell of imported tobacco and expensive brandy. Most of the men had loosened their formal attire and adopted the relaxed posture of people who believed themselves completely secure in their dominance. They were discussing Samuel Kingsley's proposal to establish a formal breeding registry that would track bloodlines across all their plantations, creating what they envisioned as a superior class of slaves, specifically bred for intelligence, strength, and docility. The conversation had become technical, almost academic, as they debated genetic principles with the same detached interest they might bring to discussions of crop rotation or soil improvement. None of them noticed when Esperanza excused herself from the dining room, ostensibly to retrieve additional brandy from the kitchen. None of them observed her careful movements as she secured every exit from the main house except the kitchen door. None of them realized that she had been gradually increasing the coal furnace's temperature throughout the evening, bringing it to a heat level that would have been dangerous even for cooking purposes. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Over the previous several days, she had used her access to the estate's storage areas to position iron shackles and chains at strategic locations throughout the house. These restraint devices, normally used for punishing rebellious slaves, were now distributed in such a way that she could quickly secure anyone she encountered. She had also prepared a special mixture based on knowledge passed down from her grandmother. A combination of local herbs that could render someone unconscious within minutes if absorbed through food or drink. This mixture had been carefully added to the brandy decanter that she'd been serving throughout the evening. As the Rice Council members continued their discussion of human breeding programs, the first effects of Esperanza's preparation began to manifest. George Baxter, who had consumed more brandy than the others, began to feel dizzy and disoriented. He attributed this to the heat and alcohol, but within minutes he was slumping in his chair, struggling to maintain consciousness. One by one, the other council members began experiencing similar symptoms. William Pemberton complained of sudden nausea. James Rutherford found himself unable to focus his eyes. Marcus Sutton's hands began trembling uncontrollably. Edmund Greyfield was the first to realize that something was seriously wrong. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice already slurring slightly, "I believe we may have been... someone has..." But before he could complete the thought, his legs gave way and he collapsed onto the imported Persian carpet that had cost him more than most colonists earned in a year. Within 20 minutes, all 14 members of the Rice Council were unconscious. Esperanza worked with methodical efficiency, using rope and iron shackles to secure each man's hands and feet. The restraints she applied were the same devices that had been used to bind thousands of slaves over the years, devices designed to cause pain and prevent escape while keeping the victim alive and functional. She took particular care to ensure that each binding was tight enough to cause considerable discomfort, but not so restrictive as to cut off circulation entirely. She had no intention of allowing these men to escape through the mercy of quick death. As she worked, she spoke to each unconscious man in Portuguese, Spanish, and broken English, sometimes explaining what she was doing, sometimes recounting specific instances of cruelty she had witnessed, sometimes simply expressing the rage that had been building inside her for 15 years. "You sell my quam like he is cow," she whispered to James Rutherford as she secured iron shackles around his ankles. "You buy and sell people like they are nothing. Tonight you learn what it feels like to be nothing." To Marcus Sutton, she said, "You break spirits. You teach people to stop being human. Tonight I teach you what broken spirit feels like." To Edmund Greyfield, her voice carried 15 years of suppressed hatred. "You own me. You think you can do whatever you want to me. You think I am animal. Tonight you see what animals do when they have no choice left." Once all 14 men were securely restrained, Esperanza began the most labor-intensive part of her plan. One by one, she dragged each unconscious body from the dining room through the house to the kitchen. This process took nearly 3 hours, as each man weighed considerably more than she did, and she had to move carefully to avoid making noise that might alert other slaves or overseers who might still be awake. By 2 a.m., all 14 members of the Rice Council were arranged in a circle around the massive coal furnace, their feet pointing toward the center, their hands secured behind their backs with iron shackles, their mouths stuffed with raw cotton to prevent them from calling for help when they regained consciousness. The furnace itself had been stoked to maximum temperature and was radiating heat that made the kitchen nearly unbearable even for someone who wasn't restrained. Esperanza had calculated that the combination of extreme heat, dehydration, and restricted movement would create a form of prolonged torture that would give these men time to contemplate their fate while slowly dying in agony. But she had also made provisions for a more immediate form of justice. As the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the kitchen windows, the Rice Council members began regaining consciousness. The herb mixture she had used was designed to cause unconsciousness for several hours, but leave no permanent impairment, ensuring that her victims would be fully aware of their situation when the torture began. Edmund Greyfield was the first to wake up, and his confusion quickly turned to terror as he realized his predicament. He was lying on the stone floor of his own kitchen, bound hand and foot with iron shackles, unable to speak because of the cotton stuffed in his mouth, and surrounded by the other members of his council in similar condition. The massive coal furnace in the center of their circle was radiating heat like a miniature version of hell itself. As the other men regained consciousness, the kitchen filled with the sound of muffled screams and desperate struggles against unbreakable restraints. They were experiencing, for the first time in their lives, the absolute helplessness that they had inflicted on thousands of other human beings. Esperanza sat calmly in a corner of the kitchen, methodically sharpening the carving knives she used for food preparation. She had positioned herself so that each man could see her clearly, and she maintained eye contact with each of them as they fully grasped the hopelessness of their situation. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said in clear English, far better English than she had ever spoken in their presence before. "I hope you rested well. We have much to discuss, and I want to make sure you are all paying attention." She stood up and walked slowly around the circle, looking down at each restrained man with the same expression of cold evaluation that they had used when inspecting slaves at the Charleston market. "For 15 years I have served your meetings. I have listened to your conversations. I have heard you discuss my people like we are cattle to be bought and sold and bred and slaughtered according to your convenience." She paused next to Marcus Sutton, who was struggling frantically against his restraints. "You, Mr. Sutton, specialize in breaking spirits. You take people who still remember being human and teach them to forget. You have perfected techniques for destroying hope, for making proud men and women into hollow shells who exist only to serve your pleasure." She moved to James Rutherford. "You, Mr. Rutherford, use family separation as a tool of control. You deliberately destroy the bonds between parents and children, between husbands and wives, because you have learned that people without families are easier to control." She continued around the circle, addressing each man by name and recounting specific acts of cruelty that she had witnessed or heard described during their monthly meetings. With each recitation, the men's struggles became more desperate and their muffled cries more frantic. Finally, she returned to Edmund Greyfield. "And you, Mr. Greyfield, are the worst of all, because you could have chosen differently. You have education, you have wealth, you have power. You could have treated us as human beings. Instead, you chose to be a monster because being a monster was more profitable." She walked back to the center of the circle, standing directly in front of the coal furnace. "Today, you are going to experience what it feels like to be powerless. You are going to learn what it means to be at the mercy of someone who views you as less than human. And you are going to die slowly, painfully, with plenty of time to think about all the suffering you have caused." With that announcement, Esperanza began the final phase of her plan. What happened over the next 6 hours would become the stuff of legend and nightmare throughout colonial South Carolina, though the full details would remain buried in sealed government archives for more than 2 centuries. Esperanza de Lima transformed the Greyfield estate kitchen into a theater of retribution where 14 of the colony's most powerful men experienced, for the first and last time, what it meant to be completely helpless in the hands of someone who viewed them as less than human. She began with psychological torture, moving slowly around the circle and forcing each man to listen as she recounted, in excruciating detail, specific instances of cruelty that she had witnessed during her 15 years of servitude. She described children torn from their mothers' arms, husbands separated from wives, proud men reduced to broken shells through systematic brutalization. She spoke in the calm, measured tone that these men typically used when discussing the management of their human property. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, kneeling beside the terrified plantation owner, Do you remember the woman named Asha? She was pregnant when you bought her in 1714. You worked her in the rice fields until the day she went into labor, then sold her baby to a trader from Georgia before she even recovered from childbirth. She cried for 3 days straight. You told your overseer to whip her for excessive noise that was disturbing your sleep. Pemberton's eyes widened with terror as he recognized the incident. Like most plantation owners, he had committed so many acts of casual cruelty that individual cases blended together in his memory. But Esperanza had remembered every detail, every name, every act of systematic dehumanization that she had witnessed. She moved to Charles Warwick. You enjoy watching punishments, Mr. Warwick. You attend whippings like other men attend horse races. Last spring, you paid Mr. Grayfield $5 to let you personally administer 50 lashes to a man who had tried to run away. You took your time, spacing the strokes so he would remain conscious for the entire punishment. You smiled the whole time. The heat from the coal furnace was becoming unbearable. Sweat poured down the faces of the restrained men, mixing with tears of terror and creating dark stains on their expensive imported clothing. Several of them had already begun showing signs of heat exhaustion, rapid breathing, flushed skin, and the glazed look that preceded collapse. But Esperanza was not finished with the psychological portion of her retribution. She retrieved a leather-bound ledger from Edmund Grayfield's study, the same book where he recorded the purchase, sale, and breeding of his human property. Opening it to a random page, she began reading entries aloud in the flat, emotionless tone that plantation owners used when discussing business transactions. April 12, 1715. Sold boy named Caesar, age 14, to Rutherford Plantation for breeding purposes. £45 sterling. Note: mother became unmanageable after separation. Recommend immediate sale or disposal. She turned the page. June 3, 1715. Female named Rebecca died in childbirth. Child survived. Estimated loss, £20 sterling. Note: implement better nutrition program for breeding females to reduce mortality rates. Page after page, she read the clinical documentation of human suffering, families destroyed, children sold, men and women reduced to monetary calculations in a businessman's ledger. Each entry represented someone's life, someone's family, someone's dreams crushed under the weight of systematic exploitation. The psychological torture continued for 2 hours, with Esperanza forcing each man to confront the full scope of his crimes against humanity. She had an extraordinary memory for detail, enhanced by 15 years of careful attention to their conversations. She could recall specific dates, individual names, particular acts of cruelty that each man had committed or ordered. But as the morning sun climbed higher and the temperature in the kitchen approached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, she moved to the next phase of her plan. From the kitchen storage area, she retrieved several long iron rods, tools typically used for stoking the coal furnace and manipulating heavy cookware. She placed these rods directly into the furnace's flames, where they quickly heated to cherry-red temperatures that would cause excruciating burns on contact with human flesh. "Gentlemen," she announced, "you have spent years perfecting techniques for causing pain without causing immediate death. You have learned how to torture people for maximum effect while keeping them alive and functional. Today, I will demonstrate that your students have been paying attention." She withdrew the first iron rod from the furnace. The metal glowed like a piece of captured sunlight, radiating heat that could be felt from several feet away. Moving to Edmund Grayfield, she held the rod close enough to his face that he could feel the intense heat without making contact. "This is for every slave you have branded like cattle," she said calmly. "This is for every human being you have marked as your property." What happened next was too brutal to describe in detail, but the screams that echoed through the Grayfield estate kitchen could be heard by slaves working in fields nearly a quarter-mile away. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard before. The desperate, agonized cries of men who had never experienced genuine helplessness and were discovering what their victims had endured for decades. Esperanza worked methodically, applying the heated iron to each man in turn, targeting non-fatal areas that would cause maximum pain while ensuring that her victims remained conscious and aware. She had learned from observing their own torture techniques, understanding exactly how much damage the human body could sustain while still maintaining the capacity for suffering. Between applications of the heated iron, she continued her psychological assault, describing in detail how each man's plantation would be inherited by relatives who might or might not continue their cruel practices. She talked about their children, wondering aloud whether the next generation would prove as evil as their fathers or might develop some capacity for human compassion. "Your son, William," she said to Marcus Sutton as he writhed in agony. "He is only 16 years old. Maybe there is still time for him to become a better man than his father. Maybe when he learns what happened to you, he will decide that treating people as property is too dangerous." The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical torture. These men had built their entire identity around the belief that they were superior beings, natural masters, who had the right to control and exploit other human beings. Esperanza was systematically destroying that identity, forcing them to experience themselves as victims, as objects to be manipulated by someone else's will. As the afternoon heat combined with the furnace's radiation to push the kitchen temperature above 130 degrees, several of the men began showing signs of severe heat stroke. Their skin turned red and dry, their breathing became rapid and shallow, and their struggles against the restraints became weaker and more desperate. But Esperanza had planned for this contingency. She had no intention of allowing them to escape through unconsciousness or heat-induced delirium. Using techniques learned from her grandmother, she applied wet cloths to their foreheads and forced small amounts of water into their mouths, keeping them conscious and aware while their bodies slowly cooked in the superheated air. "You must stay awake," she told them. "You must remain alert. Death is a mercy, and you have not earned mercy yet." The torture continued through the hottest part of the afternoon, with Esperanza maintaining the furnace at maximum temperature, while systematically applying heated iron rods to each man's body. She targeted hands, feet, and faces, areas that would cause excruciating pain while remaining visible as permanent reminders of their experience. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire ordeal was not the physical suffering, but the complete reversal of power relationships that it represented. For the first time in their lives, these 14 men were experiencing what their slaves endured every day. The knowledge that another human being had complete control over their bodies, their comfort, their very survival. They were learning what it meant to be property. As evening approached and shadows began falling across the kitchen floor, Esperanza prepared for the final act of her carefully orchestrated revenge. The coal furnace had been burning at maximum temperature for nearly 18 hours, creating a heat level that was literally unbearable for sustained human exposure. She began dragging the semi-conscious men closer to the furnace, positioning them so that the intense heat would slowly cook their bodies while keeping them alive long enough to fully appreciate their fate. It was a technique she had heard Marcus Sutton describe during one of the Rice Council meetings, a method he used for punishing slaves who attempted escape. "This is how you killed Thomas," she told Sutton as she positioned his body within 3 feet of the glowing coals. "Remember Thomas, the young man who tried to run away last summer? You put him in a metal cage in direct sunlight and let him cook slowly over 3 days. He begged for water, he begged for shade, he begged for death. You ignored all his pleas because you wanted other slaves to witness his suffering." One by one, she arranged all 14 men in positions where the furnace's radiant heat would slowly kill them while leaving them conscious long enough to contemplate their crimes. The psychological impact was as important to her as the physical destruction. She wanted them to understand, with perfect clarity, that they were dying because of choices they had made, actions they had taken, and lives they had destroyed. As the sun set on June 24, 1716, the kitchen of Greyfield Estate contained 14 dying men who were experiencing, for the first and last time, what it felt like to be completely powerless in the hands of someone who viewed them as less than human. The screaming had stopped several hours earlier, replaced by the weaker sounds of men whose vocal cords had been damaged by prolonged crying. The kitchen filled with the smell of burning flesh and the sound of labored breathing as 14 of Colonial, South Carolina's most powerful citizens slowly roasted to death beside the same furnace they had used to prepare meals served by the people they had enslaved. Esperanza sat in her corner, still methodically sharpening kitchen knives, humming the Portuguese lullaby that her mother had sung to her in the village that Portuguese raiders had destroyed 20 years earlier. She was no longer looking at the dying men, but her ears remained alert to their breathing, ensuring that none of them escaped into unconsciousness before experiencing the full measure of justice she had planned. As midnight approached, the last of the Rice Council members finally succumbed to the combination of heat, dehydration, and burns that had been slowly killing them throughout the day. Edmund Greyfield was the final survivor, his constitution strengthened by years of rich living and medical care that had never been available to his slaves. His last coherent words, spoken in a whisper barely audible above the sound of burning coal, were a pathetic attempt at bargaining. "Please, I can give you money, freedom, whatever you want." Esperanza looked at him with the same expression of mild interest that he had used when inspecting slaves at the Charleston market. "I want you to die knowing that you were wrong," she replied calmly. "You are not superior. You are not chosen by God. You are not a natural master. You are just a man who chose to be evil, and now you are paying the price for that choice." Those were the last words that Edmund Greyfield heard before the heat and dehydration finally claimed his life. Dawn broke on June 25, 1716, revealing a scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. When the other plantation slaves began their morning routines, they discovered 14 charred corpses arranged in a perfect circle around the massive coal furnace in the Greyfield estate kitchen. The bodies were barely recognizable as human, reduced to blackened shells by 18 hours of exposure to extreme heat. Esperanza de Lima was found sitting calmly at the kitchen table, methodically sharpening carving knives while humming a haunting melody that none of the other slaves recognized. She showed no signs of distress or exhaustion, despite having orchestrated and witnessed one of the most elaborate acts of revenge in colonial American history. When the plantation's white overseers arrived to investigate, they found a scene that defied their understanding of the natural order. 14 of the colony's most powerful men had been killed by a single slave woman who had somehow overpowered them all and subjected them to a form of torture that exceeded anything in their experience. The implications were terrifying. If one slave could accomplish this level of devastation against multiple plantation owners, what might happen if slaves began organizing more sophisticated forms of resistance? The psychological impact on the white colonial population was immediate and profound. For the first time, they began to fear the people they had enslaved. Word of the massacre spread throughout the colony within days, carried by riders who had been dispatched to inform the victims' families and business associates. But the colonial authorities faced a serious dilemma in deciding how to respond to the incident. On one hand, they needed to demonstrate that slave rebellion would be met with swift and brutal retaliation. The entire plantation system depended on maintaining the slaves' belief that resistance was futile and that white dominance was absolute and permanent. On the other hand, they needed to prevent the spread of detailed information about Esperanza's methods and success. If other slaves learned that 14 plantation owners could be killed by a single woman armed only with intelligence, patience, and determination, the results could be catastrophic for the entire colonial economy. Governor Robert Johnson convened an emergency session of the Colonial Council to discuss the crisis. After 3 days of heated debate, they reached a decision that prioritized political stability over public justice. The official records of the Greyfield massacre were sealed by gubernatorial order and locked in the Charleston archives with instructions that they not be opened for 50 years. The families of the victims were informed that their relatives had died in a tragic fire that had consumed the Greyfield estate kitchen during a business meeting. No mention was made of Esperanza's role in their deaths. Esperanza herself presented a more complex problem. Executing her publicly would require explaining her crimes, which would spread exactly the kind of information that the colonial government wanted to suppress. But allowing her to live would send the message that slave rebellion could succeed without consequences. The solution they devised was as cruel as it was politically expedient. Esperanza was sentenced to be sold to a Spanish trader who specialized in supplying slaves to the silver mines of South America, a fate that was universally understood to be a delayed death sentence. The working conditions in the Spanish mines were so brutal that slaves typically survived less than 2 years before succumbing to exhaustion, disease, or accidents. But even this sentence carried risks. If Esperanza managed to survive long enough to share her story with other slaves, she could become a symbol of successful resistance that might inspire additional rebellions. The colonial authorities solved this problem by ensuring that Esperanza would never reach the Spanish mines alive. On July 15, 1716, exactly 3 weeks after the Greyfield massacre, Esperanza de Lima was loaded onto a Spanish trading vessel called the Santa Isabella that was bound for Cartagena. The ship's captain had been secretly instructed to ensure that she did not survive the voyage, but to make her death appear accidental. The Santa Isabella departed Charleston Harbor on the evening tide, carrying 43 other slaves along with Esperanza. According to the ship's official log, she died of fever on the 3rd day of the voyage and was buried at sea according to standard maritime practice. But there were rumors. Some of the surviving slaves from the Greyfield estate claimed that Esperanza had spoken of contingency plans, of allies in the Spanish territories who would help her escape if she could survive the ocean voyage. Others whispered that she had been seen speaking with free black sailors in Charleston Harbor, possibly arranging for assistance during the trip. Most significantly, several slaves reported that Esperanza had spent her final weeks at the estate teaching other domestic workers about herbs, about anatomy, about the weaknesses of their masters, and the vulnerabilities of the plantation system. "Justice burns slower than coal," she had told them, "but burns complete. The fire I started will spread to other kitchens, other plantations, other masters who think they are safe." Whether these rumors contained any truth was impossible to determine. The colonial authorities had moved quickly to disperse the surviving slaves from Greyfield estate, selling them to plantations throughout the region to prevent any coordination of their stories or their activities. But the psychological damage was already done. In the months following the Greyfield massacre, a wave of unrest swept through the slave communities of South Carolina. There were no additional mass killings like Esperanza's methodical execution of the Rice Council members, but plantation owners began reporting an unprecedented series of smaller incidents that suggested coordinated resistance. Kitchen fires destroyed several plantation houses under suspicious circumstances. Valuable livestock died mysteriously after consuming feed that may have been poisoned. White overseers suffered unusual accidents at precisely the moments when they were most vulnerable. Tools and weapons disappeared from storage areas, only to be found days later in locations that suggested slave involvement. Most disturbing to the colonial authorities, slaves began demonstrating knowledge of their owners' personal habits, business arrangements, and family relationships that went far beyond what their duties should have provided. It was as if an intelligence network had developed throughout the plantation system, with information flowing freely between properties that had previously been isolated from each other. The psychological impact on the white colonial population was profound and lasting. Plantation owners who had previously moved through their properties with casual confidence now traveled with armed escorts and avoided predictable routines. The monthly meetings that had been a cornerstone of the Rice Council's coordination were suspended indefinitely, as no one wanted to gather in large groups that might present attractive targets for revenge. Some plantation owners began modifying their treatment of slaves, not out of moral awakening, but from practical fear. If slaves were capable of the kind of sophisticated planning and execution that Esperanza had demonstrated, then maintaining their loyalty through slightly better treatment might be a wise investment in personal security. But other owners moved in the opposite direction, implementing even harsher controls and punishments in an attempt to terrorize their slaves into submission. These plantations experienced higher rates of escape attempts, work slowdowns, and mysterious accidents that suggested their strategies were backfiring. The colonial government responded by implementing new laws that restricted slave movement, prohibited gatherings of more than 3 slaves without white supervision, and mandated harsh penalties for any slave caught with weapons or tools that could be used as weapons. But these laws were difficult to enforce across the scattered plantation system, and they may have actually encouraged more sophisticated forms of resistance by driving slave organization underground. Perhaps most significantly, the story of Esperanza de Lima began circulating through the network of free black communities, underground railroad stations, and sympathetic white abolitionists who were beginning to organize opposition to slavery. Her name became a symbol of resistance that inspired other acts of rebellion throughout the American colonies. Historians would later debate whether the Grayfield Massacre represented an isolated incident of individual revenge or the beginning of a more systematic form of slave resistance that contributed to the eventual collapse of the plantation system. The sealed colonial records made definitive analysis impossible, but the circumstantial evidence suggested that Esperanza's actions had inspired copycat incidents throughout the South. In 1739, 23 years after the Grayfield Massacre, the Stono Rebellion erupted in South Carolina, the largest slave uprising in colonial American history. While the specific connections to Esperanza's actions could not be proven, some of the rebellion's leaders were slaves who had worked on plantations that were connected to the original Rice Council network. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but it demonstrated that the psychological impact of the Grayfield Massacre had not faded with time. Slaves throughout the region had learned that their masters were not invulnerable, that careful planning could overcome superior numbers and weapons, and that acts of resistance could succeed even against seemingly impossible odds. As the years passed and the American Revolution transformed the political landscape of the colonies, the story of Esperanza de Lima became part of the oral tradition that sustained slave communities through their darkest hours. Parents told their children about the woman who had made 14 masters pay for their crimes. Young slaves learned that resistance was possible, that intelligence and patience could be more powerful than physical strength, and that justice might be delayed but would eventually arrive. The sealed records in Charleston's archives remained unopened for exactly 50 years as Governor Johnson had ordered. When they were finally made available to researchers in 1766, the American colonies were in the midst of political upheaval that would lead to independence from Britain. The story of the Grayfield Massacre was overshadowed by larger historical events, but it contributed to a growing awareness that the institution of slavery contained the seeds of its own destruction. By the time the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, the plantation system that had seemed so permanent and invincible in 1716 was already showing signs of internal stress that would eventually tear the nation apart. The psychological impact of knowing that slaves could organize, plan, and execute sophisticated acts of resistance had fundamentally changed the relationship between master and slave. The masters were no longer confident in their absolute power. The slaves were no longer convinced of their absolute powerlessness. And in that shift of psychological balance lay the beginning of the end of American slavery. In the years that followed the Grayfield Massacre, whispers of the truth began to emerge from the most unexpected sources. A Spanish ship's clerk, writing in his private journal during a voyage to Cartagena in late 1716, recorded an extraordinary conversation with a Portuguese-speaking woman who had been secretly transferred from the Santa Isabella during a supply stop in Havana. According to the clerk's account, this woman spoke with remarkable intelligence about the plantation system in South Carolina, describing in precise detail the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of individual plantation owners throughout the colony. She claimed to have orchestrated what she called the first lesson, but suggested that it would not be the last. The fire that began in one kitchen, she reportedly told the clerk, will spread to many kitchens. The lessons I learned from watching masters at their evil work are now being taught to new students. Oh, whether this woman was truly Esperanza de Lima could never be confirmed, but colonial records from Spanish Florida began documenting the arrival of unusually well-informed escaped slaves who possessed detailed knowledge of plantation operations throughout the British territories. These refugees seemed to have access to an intelligence network that extended far beyond what individual escapees should have known. More disturbing to the colonial authorities, reports began filtering back from Spanish territories describing communities of former slaves who were actively supporting escape attempts and resistance activities in the British colonies. Letters intercepted by colonial officials contained detailed instructions for identifying sympathetic contacts, avoiding patrol routes, and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of plantation owners who had grown careless in their confidence. By 1720, just 4 years after the Greyfield Massacre, the colonial government was forced to acknowledge that slave resistance had evolved beyond individual escape attempts into something approaching organized warfare. Plantation owners throughout South Carolina began reporting coordinated incidents that suggested systematic planning and intelligence gathering. Kitchen fires destroyed several plantation houses under circumstances that defied natural explanation. Valuable livestock died mysteriously after consuming feed that appeared to have been deliberately poisoned. White overseers suffered fatal accidents at moments when they were most isolated and vulnerable. Most unsettling of all, slaves began demonstrating knowledge of their masters' personal habits, business relationships, and family secrets that went far beyond what their assigned duties should have revealed. It was as if an invisible network had developed throughout the plantation system, with information flowing freely between properties that had previously been isolated from each other. The psychological transformation was profound and lasting. Plantation owners who had moved through their properties with casual arrogance now traveled with armed escorts and avoided predictable routines. The monthly gatherings that had been central to the Rice Council's coordination were permanently suspended, as no one wanted to present an attractive target for coordinated revenge. Some masters began modifying their treatment of slaves, not from moral awakening, but from practical terror. If their human property was capable of the sophisticated planning and execution that had destroyed the Rice Council, then maintaining loyalty through slightly better conditions might be a wise investment in personal survival. But other plantation owners responded with increased brutality, implementing harsher punishments and more restrictive controls in desperate attempts to terrorize their slaves into absolute submission. These plantations experienced higher rates of mysterious accidents, work slowdowns, and escape attempts that suggested their strategies were having the opposite effect. The colonial government imposed new laws restricting slave movement, prohibiting gatherings, and mandating severe penalties for any slave found with potential weapons. But these regulations were difficult to enforce across the scattered plantation system, and they may have actually encouraged more sophisticated forms of underground organization. As the decades passed, the story of Esperanza de Lima became woven into the fabric of slave resistance throughout the American colonies. Parents whispered to their children about the woman who had made 14 masters pay for their cruelty. Young slaves learned that their masters were not invulnerable, that careful planning could overcome superior numbers and weapons, and that justice might be delayed but would eventually arrive. The sealed records in Charleston's archives remained locked away, as Governor Johnson had ordered, but the truth had already escaped through other channels. Every slave community knew the essential facts. One woman, armed only with intelligence and determination, had killed 14 of the most powerful men in the colony and had lived to escape their justice. Whether Esperanza truly survived to continue her work in Spanish Florida, or whether the reports of her later activities were legends created to inspire hope in desperate people, became less important than the psychological impact of her story. The masters were no longer confident in their absolute power. The slaves were no longer convinced of their absolute powerlessness. And in that fundamental shift of psychological balance lay the seeds of everything that would follow: the growing resistance movements, the underground railroad networks, the persistent rebellions that would eventually contribute to the destruction of the entire plantation system. The kitchen at Greyfield Estate stood empty for 66 years after that night of reckoning, gradually falling into ruin as subsequent owners found the building impossible to staff. Local slaves refused to work in the room where Esperanza had demonstrated what happened to masters who pushed their human property beyond endurance. Eventually, the entire structure was demolished and the land left to return to wilderness. But the lesson remained. passed down through generations of enslaved families who understood that those who choose to treat other human beings as property do so at their own peril. Property can think. Property can plan. Property can remember everything. And sometimes, when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, property fights back. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the archives of our nation's dark history? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this remarkable tale of resistance and revenge. If you enjoyed this journey into America's hidden past and want more stories that reveal the truth behind official histories, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the power of untold stories. History is written by the victors, but sometimes the voices of the victims find a way to be heard across the centuries. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the dark secrets that shaped our nation.